Brian O'Day pulled off one of the greatest marijuana smuggling operations in history, masterminding the distribution of more than $300 million into the United States in the 1980s. He developed an elaborate criminal network with over 100 people reaching across the world, involving bribery of public officials, secret communication systems, a vast network of boats, trucks, ships, and safe houses. However, with enough money to rival Colombian drug lords, Brian made many enemies, some even from his close friends who would eventually betray him. So, how did a boy with a normal upbringing from a well-to-do family turn into one of the world's most notorious drug smugglers? He had connections reaching Colombia, the Golden Triangle in Asia, involving dealing with the Vietnamese military and even a corrupt ex-DEA agent. Greed, ambition, and an insane appetite for risk allowed O'Day to reach the top of the drug smuggling underworld, amassing a personal fortune that most people only dream of. However, his vast wealth and illegal operations eventually caught the attention of authorities, and his lavish lifestyle and drug empire would eventually come crashing down. This is the insane true story of Brian O'Day, one of the world's most notorious drug smugglers. Born on September 1st, 1948 in St. John's, Newfoundland, Canada, Brian was raised in a supportive family. The middle child of 5, his parents, well known in Newfoundland for their business acumen and political influence, fostered a socially engaging household. This upbringing immersed Brian in a world that highly valued success and reputation. He attended local schools where the discipline was strict and the academic standards high. However, beneath this veneer of normalcy, Brian harbored a dark secret. At the tender age of 11, he suffered abuse at the hands of a Christian brother at St. Bonaventure's College. This experience traumatized him, shaping his views on trust and authority. In 1965, while at Memorial University of Newfoundland, Brian showcased his entrepreneurial skills by hosting a radio show and handling advertising sales. It was during this time that Brian's life started to take a dark turn, and he began smoking marijuana and quickly progressed to dealing. Sourcing drugs from Toronto and selling them in St. John's, he displayed a knack for business and a willingness to take risks. This endeavor, though small in scale, marked the start of what would soon escalate into a vast global drug operation. After university, Brian intensified his operations, importing cannabis from the UK and significantly expanding his enterprise. However, his drug smuggling career went horribly wrong when in 1972 he was arrested for possession with intent to distribute, leading to a 19-month prison sentence, a sobering reality check for a young, ambitious O'Day. Prison life was tough and was like a third-world ghetto with no basic amenities and forced labor. However, it was there that Brian sharpened his criminal skills, learning from other inmates involved in gangs and drug dealing. This period served as an unintended masterclass in criminal entrepreneurship, molding him into a more adept figure in the illicit trade that landed him in prison in the first place. Upon his release, armed with a mere $500 and a business card from a fellow inmate, Brian plunged straight back into drug smuggling, this time ambitiously heading to Colombia. This trip marked the beginning of his dealings into the world of cocaine smuggling. Arriving in Bogota, he navigated the foreign city for hours in the hot, scorching sun, seeking out a contact named Benny, who was a local restaurant owner. However, upon discovering that Benny's restaurant was closed, Brian resourcefully made a new connection with a local Colombian. He explained his business plan, which was not exactly very detailed. After all, he had was a business card of some guy named Benny and $50 American in his pocket. The Colombians, initially skeptical but intrigued by his boldness, provided him with 50 grams of cocaine worth $500. Brian learned an innovative trick from the Colombians of concealing drugs in cigarette packs, enabling him to smuggle cocaine back to Canada, where he sold it for an incredible $5,000 profit. But Brian had ambitions for much bigger things. And it wouldn't be long before Brian escalated from hiding drugs in cigarette packs to smuggling large amounts of drugs in cargo planes. He would risk it all on dangerous drug smuggling runs, like that fateful night over the Caribbean. He recalls how the engines of their aged DC-6 cargo plane droned eastward, packed with drugs bound for the States. As co-pilot, Brian rode alongside his buddy Dick, the veteran pilot guiding their latest run from Colombia. But disaster struck mid-flight, a hydraulic fluid leak which had the potential to prevent their landing gear from deploying and resulting in a major crash. With no safe place to land back in Colombia, Dick banked the lumbering aircraft towards Florida, their lives now hanging by a thread. In a desperate bid to get the plane on the ground in one piece, Dick hatched an emergency plan. Brian would pour replacement hydraulic fluid into the engine at precisely the right moment before their landing. As they approached the rural Georgia airport by cover of night and flying low below radar detection, Brian scrambled to the back of the aircraft where the cases of hydraulic fluid were stored. Fighting back panic, he opened the cases and lined up the fluid cans. Dick instructed Brian from the cockpit to dump the cans of fluid into the engine. Hands trembling, Brian feverishly drained can after can. The engines quieted for the landing approach, then a bump and rumble. Incredibly, their plan worked, and the gear lurched down into place. By luck as much as skill, Brian had pulled off another successful smuggling operation. Shifting focus to 1980s LA, a cocaine hub, Brian trafficked cocaine from Colombia using yet another inventive method. This time, he dissolved cocaine, soaked Colombian wool ponchos in it, and after drying, the cocaine remained in the wool, which he would extract in a secret garage lab in LA. This operation ran successfully until 1984. This method proved to be a huge success for years until something unexpected happened. When in 1984, the High Times magazine exposed the cocaine poncho method, forcing him to immediately shut down and move his operations near San Diego. Surprisingly, after dealing with the stress of being a drug smuggler for years, there was a time when Brian aspired to enter legitimate business. He distributed Tri-Hair products in Canada, having met John Paul DeJoria and even invested in his enterprise. However, despite this venture into legality, his life remained deeply intertwined with crime. Molded by early experiences, prison time, and his daring nature, the lure of easy money was irresistible to Brian. So much so, in fact, that he began plotting what would become one of the largest drug operations in history, valued at a staggering $300 million. Even for an experienced smuggler like Brian, this was a huge step up and would require an elaborate covert operation with intense planning and a vast network spanning across the world, and would be described by Brian and his colleagues as the motherlode. Brian knew the stakes were high, and getting caught would carry a hefty jail sentence. The thoughts of being separated from his family weighed on him, but this deal would set him up for life, a deal too tempting to pass on. In the 1980s, Washington State's 600-mile coastline, rife with harbors, became a prime spot for drug trafficking, attracting Brian to a deal that would be his biggest operation ever. He partnered with Tony Franilovich, an experienced commercial fisherman, who brought vital resources, boats, dock access, and local know-how. Brian knew all the right people for the job, and his next key players were the Schaefer brothers, very wealthy drug smugglers. After presenting his plan to them, they immediately could see the size of the operation and invested $10 million, funding an audacious scheme to transport an incredible 60 tons of marijuana from Southeast Asia to the US. O'Day's connections within the notorious Golden Triangle, a region well known for its drug trade, enabled him to procure an exceptionally potent strain of marijuana, a variety unprecedented in North America. Following this acquisition, the crew with O'Day in charge embarked on orchestrating a highly complex operation, one that required detailed planning and precise execution. They utilized two fishing boats, the Cathy B and the Stormbird, and spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on modifications, transforming them into smuggling giants. They modified cargo spaces, installed scales, and added shrink wrap equipment and accounting tools. The boats were now ready to secretly transport tons of marijuana. A 12-member crew was assembled for the operation, splitting roles between operating the fishing boats and offloading marijuana. Essential communication was maintained, linking boats, cars, and safe houses, all done through radios and payphones, using coded conversations to ensure secrecy. A ground transport operation was also established, complete with semi-trucks. Brian even made drivers attend truck driving school and rehearse carefully planned routes across the Pacific Northwest. The first cannabis shipment was transferred from an initial ship to the Cathy B in Alaska. In a secluded fjord, 25 tons of marijuana were meticulously inspected for mildew and repackaged into wetlock fish boxes, each bearing O'Day's logo. The shipment then traveled south, skirting U.S. waters to Anacortes, Washington. Semi-trailer trucks filled with aromatic cedar to disguise the scent then transported the cargo to California for buyers. The first shipment went off without a hitch. Brian was elated. It all seemed too easy. However, in the world of high-stakes drug smuggling, things don't tend to go smoothly for long. Soon trouble arose in the form of a problematic crew member. This individual, struggling with a severe cocaine addiction and exhibiting reckless behavior, became a major problem. His flashy arrivals at safe houses with a limousine full of prostitutes and high on cocaine was a huge security risk. The last thing Brian needed was to draw attention to their operation from authorities. Brian had no choice but to fire him and gave him a bunch of cash to ensure his silence, a decision he would later regret. Despite the setback, Brian remained focused and worked on the next shipment, which involved a massive 42-ton load of marijuana, which is the equivalent in size to 60 small cars. However, unknown to Brian, the fired crew member had turned on him and was now a police informant, alerting law enforcement of the entire operation. As a result, the DEA and Coast Guard started surveillance. They watched every move O'Day made. But Brian was always one step ahead of authorities. Thanks to advanced spying tools, he was able to intercept communication between police and worked out they were onto him. In a state of panic, O'Day immediately changed his plans and went into hiding, communicating with his crew through a network of public payphones using code language at all times. The Stormbird, their outfitted smuggling boat packed with 42 tons of cannabis, was now in danger of being identified. This was a nightmare that O'Day had always feared. They quickly concealed the 42-ton shipment by camouflaging the Stormbird in a remote fjord, covering it with netting and cutting power to avoid aerial detection. The crew guarding the ship camped in the forest, staying warm with fires at night and blankets, eagerly awaiting for the instructions of their next move. This critical situation led to an urgent meeting between O'Day, Hranolovich, and the Schaefer brothers. They crafted a clever plan to transfer the cargo to a new, inconspicuous boat the authorities were not looking for, and in a risky operation planned to offload the cannabis to a different port, quickly load it onto trucks and escape. In a bold move in broad daylight, Brian sent the new boat, now loaded with 42 tons of marijuana, directly to Bellingham, Washington. O'Day, however, stayed on the Stormbird as a decoy, knowing the police were ready to strike. On a Saturday morning, 42 tons of cannabis were rapidly offloaded in downtown Bellingham, an intense process completed in a matter of hours. Brian's heart was racing when he sailed into the harbor on the Stormbird, with investigators ready to make what they believed to be a major bust in Canadian drug smuggling history. However, to their shock, they found the boat spotlessly clean, no drugs anywhere. The decoy plan had succeeded. While Brian and his crew triumphed this time, being tricked only enraged authorities even more, and Brian was now at the top of their wanted list, and eventually the tables would turn. At the height of his drug smuggling career, with more wealth than he could manage, Brian's life began spiraling out of control. Enjoying the proceeds from his successful motherlode smuggling operation, Brian developed a severe cocaine addiction. Despite handling massive deals worth up to $300 million, he recalls hiding in a friend's guest house snorting my brains out while orchestrating complex cross-border shipments. O'Day's addiction and risky lifestyle eventually caught up with him when he endured a major cocaine overdose. He remembers going unconscious from a heart attack and having a near-death experience, where he was given a choice between life and death. The experience shook him, and he did in fact manage to get clean and start turning his life around, but it was too little too late, as his past was closing in on him. Living luxuriously in Santa Barbara, California, his vast drug smuggling activities had caught the DEA's attention. A tip from an associate confirmed his worst fears. He was once again under investigation. The DEA was tipped off about Brian's operation by an informant from his team, seeking leniency for their legal issues. This informant spilled details on smuggling routes and key figures. With this info, the DEA initiated a covert operation using then-advanced satellite tracking and electronic surveillance to monitor Brian's communications and movements. Brian tried to evade the DEA, but their persistent tracking began to pay off. Surveillance captured meetings between Brian and associates at various discrete locations, and wiretaps recorded conversations implicating him in drug trafficking. The DEA struck a major blow to Brian's operation by intercepting a marijuana shipment, tracking it back through a network of shell companies and fake IDs that linked back to him. An undercover agent crucially penetrated Brian's network as a buyer, gaining trust and gathering damning evidence over months. This included recordings of Brian's incriminating conversations, leading to further raids, large marijuana seizures, and ultimately arrests. On May 31, 1990, the DEA arrested Brian, ending his drug trafficking career for good. He faced a federal court specializing in high-profile drug cases and was charged with drug trafficking, conspiracy, and money laundering. The case against him was strong, and Brian's sentence was reduced to 10 years. His downfall was a DEA victory in the war on drugs. As for Brian, he eventually turned his life around and would go on to become a leading advocate for drug policy reform. Although from the outside, the life of a drug smuggler could seem impressive. In the end, crime never pays, and drugs destroy lives.